The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under the fading light of dusk, its arid landscape bathed in hues of deep orange and crimson. Harlan Graves had been running trains for over 30 years, and he had seen just about everything, from rockslides to sudden sandstorms, but nothing quite like this. Up ahead, kicking up a thick cloud of dust, stood 6 wild mustangs, perfectly aligned across the tracks. They weren't galloping across, spooked by the oncoming train. They weren't even grazing nearby. They were just standing there, staring straight at him, their dark eyes unreadable in the dimming light. His grip tightened on the throttle as he let out a long, piercing blast of the train's horn. The Union Pacific 4872 roared through the quiet desert, a mechanical beast cutting through the stillness. Any other animal would have bolted at the sound, especially wild horses. But these mustangs didn't move an inch. Their powerful bodies remained tense, their hooves planted firmly against the gravel. They weren't frozen in fear. No, it almost felt like they were waiting for him. A cold prickle ran down the back of Harlan's neck. He reached for the radio, flipping the switch with a slightly unsteady hand. "Roy, you there?" A burst of static crackled through before the familiar voice of Roy Tinsley, the rail dispatcher, came on. "Yeah, I'm here. What's going on?" Harlan kept his eyes locked on the mustangs as he responded. "Got a herd of wild horses dead center on the tracks. I hit the horn, but they ain't moving." There was a long pause on the other end, too long. When Roy finally spoke, his voice was quieter now, edged with something Harlan couldn't quite place. "Harlan, listen to me real careful. Whatever you do, don't get off that train." A deep, unsettled feeling coiled in Harlan's gut. The brakes hissed as the locomotive started slowing, steel grinding against steel, but the horses still wouldn't budge. The dust swirled around them in the fading light, their muscular bodies rigid, their heads held high. Their eyes, dark as coal, never left him. Something about this wasn't right. And as the train inched closer to a full stop, Harlan realized one thing: those mustangs weren't just standing there by chance. They were waiting for him. If this mystery has you hooked and you want to find out what happens next, don't forget to leave a like. It helps us keep bringing you thrilling stories. And if you're not part of our community yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapters. What are these mustangs waiting for? Find out soon. The train groaned as it slowed, the brakes screeching against the steel rails, sending sparks into the dry desert air. The mustangs didn't flinch. They remained perfectly still, their muscular bodies illuminated by the train's headlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the gravel. Harlan Graves had seen strange things in his years on the tracks, but there was something deeply unnatural about this. Wild horses weren't supposed to act this way. They should have scattered the moment they heard the rumble of the train. Instead, they stood there, watching him, not with fear, but with something else. Something closer to expectation. He reached for the radio again, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped the switch. "Roy, you still there?" His voice came out gruffer than usual, his throat suddenly dry. The radio crackled before Roy's voice returned, tight and uneasy. "Yeah, and I mean it, Harlan. Don't step off that train." Harlan swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the mustangs. "You wanna tell me why?" "Because I'm about 10 seconds from getting out there and clearing the damn tracks myself." Roy didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower now, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "A crew went missing on that stretch 20 years ago. They stopped for a herd of mustangs too. Never sent another transmission. We found the train a day later, engine still running. No bodies. No signs of a struggle. Just a gone." Harlan's grip on the radio tightened. He wanted to dismiss it as old railroad folklore, something the guys at the yard cooked up to mess with the rookies. But there was something in Roy's tone that made his stomach twist. He wasn't joking. He was afraid. Outside, the horses still hadn't moved. Their dark eyes reflected the train's headlights, glowing unnaturally in the night. Then, slowly, one of them took a step forward. Harlan's breath hitched. It wasn't the movement itself that unsettled him, it was the way it happened. Deliberate, measured, almost human. The train came to a full stop with a final, heavy sigh of the brakes. The only sound now was the distant howl of the desert wind, curling through the scrub and rattling against the metal of the locomotive. Harlan sat there, gripping the throttle, pulse pounding in his ears. And then, one of the mustangs opened its mouth. Not to neigh, not to snort, but to speak. Harlan's breath caught in his throat. He had to be imagining it. A trick of the wind, a distortion of sound from the cooling metal of the train, maybe even the distant hum of the desert at night. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't the wind. The mustang standing in the center of the tracks had opened its mouth. Its lips trembled slightly, its nostrils flaring as if something inside of it was struggling to escape. The others remained behind it, motionless, their eyes fixed on him like silent sentinels. Harlan gripped the throttle, suddenly aware of the cold sweat gathering at the back of his neck. Something wasn't right. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. Then he heard it. A low, guttural whisper, more vibration than sound, but unmistakable. It wasn't a whinny or a snort. It was a word. Leave. The voice didn't echo. It didn't belong to the desert. It belonged to something else. Something old. The single word slithered through the air, creeping into his ears, settling in his bones. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to throw the train into reverse and get the hell out of there, but his hands wouldn't move. He felt like he was anchored in place, frozen under the weight of those eyes, dark, knowing, watching him too closely, too intelligently. His fingers finally found the radio, fumbling as he flipped the switch. "Roy," he rasped, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. One of them, one of the damn horses just... He stopped himself. Saying it out loud made it real, made it sound insane. But he didn't have to finish. Roy didn't laugh. He didn't ask Harlan to repeat himself. Instead, his voice came back over the radio low, steady, and edged with something close to fear. "You heard it, didn't you?" Harlan's stomach dropped. His pulse pounded against his skull. Roy knew. He had known from the moment Harlan first called in. His dispatcher, the guy who sat in a control room miles away, safe in a chair with a hot cup of coffee, already knew exactly what was happening out here. "Roy," Harlan whispered, gripping the radio so hard his knuckles turned white. "What the hell is this?" But before Roy could answer, the Mustang in front of him took another step forward. And this time, every single horse behind it moved with it, their hooves striking the gravel in perfect, unnatural unison. Dust curled around their legs, the sound of their synchronized steps sending a shiver up Harlan's spine. They weren't just standing on the tracks anymore. They were advancing. He should have reversed the train. He should have done something. But he couldn't move. Because now, watching those horses approach, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. They weren't just wild mustangs. And they weren't here by accident. They had been waiting for him. Harlan's hands were trembling. He had spent a lifetime working these rails, watching endless miles of track stretch across the American West, knowing every inch of steel and wood beneath his wheels. The train had always been his domain, his safety, his control. But now, sitting in the cab, staring down a line of mustangs that shouldn't be acting this way, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pure, unfiltered fear. The horses moved in perfect unison, each step measured, precise, like soldiers marching toward an invisible line. Their hooves struck the gravel softly, their movements eerily silent except for the shifting dust rising in the dim glow of the train's headlights. Harlan's pulse pounded in his ears as the lead horse, the one that had spoken, stopped just feet from the front of the locomotive. It lifted its head slightly, ears twitching. And then, it locked eyes with him. Harlan had been around animals his whole life. He knew the look of a predator. He knew the wide-eyed panic of prey. But this was something else. The Mustang's gaze wasn't wild or fearful. It was intentional, calculating, as if it knew something Harlan didn't. His fingers hovered over the throttle. He could still throw the train into reverse, back away from whatever unnatural force had planted itself on the tracks. But something in his gut told him it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't let him leave. The radio crackled again. Harlan. Roy's voice was tense, barely above a whisper. Do you see it yet? Harlan's throat tightened. He forced himself to speak. See what? But even as the words left his mouth, his stomach twisted into knots. Because just beyond the Mustangs, past the veil of swirling dust, the tracks had disappeared. His eyes darted to the ground, searching for the steel rails that should have stretched endlessly into the desert. But they weren't there. The wooden ties were missing. The bed of gravel simply ended, swallowed by darkness. The train was sitting on a path that shouldn't exist. His grip on the throttle turned to iron. Roy, he said, voice hollow. The tracks, they're gone. Another pause on the radio. This time, when Roy spoke, his voice was barely more than breath. That's how it starts. Harlan's chest tightened as the lead Mustang took another step forward, its dark eyes reflecting something that wasn't just the train's headlights. Something deeper, older. And then, the radio cut to static. Harlan's breath came in shallow bursts as he gripped the controls, his knuckles bloodless from the force of his grip. The tracks were gone. Not broken. Not covered by sand. Just gone. The Union Pacific 4872, a machine built for movement, for following the endless lines of steel and wood, now sat suspended in a place that shouldn't exist. His mind screamed for logic, for an explanation, but deep down, something primal whispered that there was no reason to be found here. Only inevitability. The Mustangs stood motionless in the swirling dust, their sleek bodies eerily still, eyes fixed on him with a patience that felt ancient. Harlan knew animals. He had watched deer freeze in the headlights, rabbits dart at the last second, coyotes slink back into the brush. But these horses weren't frozen in fear. They weren't waiting for him to move. They were expecting him to react. The lead Mustang, the one that had spoken, took another deliberate step forward. Its hooves didn't even make a sound. Every instinct screamed at Harlan to throw the train into reverse, to try and move, but how could he? There were no tracks. He'd be driving the locomotive straight into the black unknown. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't Roy's voice. The static stretched, long and distorted, before a whisper crawled through the speaker. A voice. Hollow. Distant. Familiar. Harlan Graves. You're late. His stomach turned to ice. He knew that voice. It had been years, decades, but he had heard it before. Miles Carter. A man who had worked this exact stretch of track back when Harlan was just a rookie. But Miles had disappeared 20 years ago. His throat felt tight, dry as the desert air. Miles. His own voice sounded foreign to him, raw and unsteady. More static. Then laughter. Soft at first, but rising, layered, as if more than one voice had joined in. The sound slithered through the cab, wrong in a way Harlan couldn't describe. He slammed his hand on the radio, trying to cut the feed, but the laughter didn't stop. It echoed through the cabin, bouncing off metal, filling the space like a tangible thing. Like it was inside the train with him. Then, outside, the Mustangs moved. Not toward him, but apart. Splitting into two perfect lines, they created a narrow opening in the middle of the tracks, revealing a path that led into the darkness. A road that shouldn't be there, carved into the nothingness where the rails had vanished. And standing in that opening was Miles Carter. But Miles wasn't alive. What now? What should Harlan do? Should he follow the eerie path where the tracks vanished? Or try to escape, even though something unexplainable awaits? Comment below what you would do in his place. Harlan's breath turned shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had seen Miles Carter's picture on the missing posters when he was younger. Back then, it had been just another rail yard story. One of those whispered warnings passed between railroad men over black coffee and cigarette smoke. You ever stop for the mustangs, you don't come back. He never believed it. Not really. But now, Miles stood right in front of him, framed between the unmoving horses, his figure half shrouded in the dust that clung to the dead air. But something was wrong. Horribly, impossibly wrong. Miles hadn't aged a day. He still looked like the man in the old photographs, early 40s, lean, the same sunburnt skin and piercing blue eyes. But his clothes were all wrong. They were the exact same ones he had been wearing the night he vanished. His denim work jacket, his railroad-issued boots, even the rust-colored bandana around his neck. They should have been tattered, faded, covered in 2 decades of desert rot. But they weren't. They looked preserved. And then Miles moved. Not with the stiff, uneven gait of a man lost in the desert for years, but smoothly, deliberately. His boots didn't crunch against the gravel. His jacket didn't rustle in the wind. He walked as if he wasn't really walking at all, as if the space between each step didn't quite exist. Harlan's fingers tightened around the throttle, his entire body screaming at him to throw the train into reverse, to do anything but sit here and watch whatever the hell Miles Carter had become. But something held him there. Something stronger than fear. "Harlan Graves," Miles said, his voice carrying unnaturally through the open air. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Like Miles had been expecting him. Like he had always been waiting for him. Harlan's skin crawled. His mouth was dry, his voice barely more than a whisper when he finally spoke. "Miles? That can't be you." Miles tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, too slowly, his lips curled into a smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd give an old friend. It was something else. Something that didn't belong on a human face. "You're late, Harlan." The mustangs behind him stomped their hooves in unison, the sound reverberating through the stillness. A rhythmic, deliberate pounding, like a heartbeat against the earth. Like a countdown. And Harlan realized, too late, that this wasn't just about the past. This was about him. Harlan's pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the world. This wasn't possible. He was staring at a man who had been gone for 20 years, a man who should have been nothing but bones buried beneath the desert sand. But Miles Carter was here, whole, unchanged, untouched by time, standing between the lines of unmoving mustangs like a ghost that had never quite learned how to leave. But ghosts didn't cast shadows. And Harlan could see Miles' silhouette stretching long across the gravel, dark and solid beneath the train's headlights. This wasn't an apparition. This was something else. Something that wore Miles' face, spoke with his voice, and now was calling his name. "Harlan Graves," Miles said again, his voice even, patient. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Harlan's throat tightened. He shook his head. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. All he had done was follow the tracks, same as he had for decades. Nothing had been different. Nothing except for the mustangs. For the first time since he had started working this route, he had been forced to stop. And something, something that had been waiting for years, had finally caught up to him. Miles took another step forward, the mustangs behind him stomping their hooves in perfect time, sending small tremors through the ground. "You're on the wrong side of the tracks, Harlan." His lips curled again, That same too slow, too wide smile. And it's time to settle up. A sharp, prickling sensation ran down Harlan's spine. His instincts screamed at him to move, to reverse the train, to escape. But the steel rails had vanished, replaced by an abyss of nothingness. And even if they had still been there, he knew, deep in his gut, deep in the place that still believed in old railroad tales and campfire warnings, that this was never about the train. This was about him. "I don't owe you anything, Miles," Harlan said, though his voice felt smaller than it should have. Miles' smile didn't falter. He tilted his head, slow, deliberate. "You sure about that?" The mustangs moved again, their heads lowering, their dark eyes fixed on Harlan like they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to remember. And that was when it hit him, a memory, sudden and violent, crashing into him like a runaway locomotive. Harlan had seen Miles Carter on this stretch of track before. Not 20 years ago. Not in some old story. He had seen him last week. Miles hadn't been a ghost then. He had been a man. A man standing too close to the rails. A man who had waved at him, just once, before Harlan's train had torn through the desert, its wheels screaming against the metal, too fast to stop. The realization sucked the air from his lungs. And Miles? Miles just kept smiling. The memory hit Harlan like a derailment. A week ago, on this same stretch of track, he had been running late, pushing the Union Pacific 4872 harder than he should have, trying to make up lost time. He remembered the dry heat pressing against the windows, the endless dust devils swirling across the barren landscape. And then, a figure on the tracks. A man, standing too close, too still. Miles Carter. Harlan had barely registered the face before instinct took over. He had pulled the horn, thrown the brakes, but it was already too late. At that speed, with that much weight behind him, the train wouldn't stop for another mile. He hadn't looked back. He hadn't wanted to. The railroad had strict rules about reporting incidents, but out here, in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, sometimes things just got lost. But Miles hadn't been lost. He was right here. Whole. Unchanged. Smiling like he had been expecting Harlan all along. The mustangs stood in perfect formation, sentinels of something older than the railroad, older than Harlan's guilt, older than the steel tracks themselves. Their dark eyes flickered in the dim light, unreadable, as if they knew something he didn't. The leader, the one that had whispered before, stomped its hoof against the gravel, sending up a small cloud of dust. Miles took another step forward. "You never stopped, Harlan." His voice was calm, even. Too even. "You saw me. You heard me. And you let the train do the rest." Harlan's pulse pounded against his skull. He wanted to argue, to tell Miles that it hadn't been his fault, that there had been nothing he could have done. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, in the place where he still carried the weight of every mistake, every close call, he knew the truth. He had convinced himself that if he didn't look back, if he didn't check the reports, then it had never really happened. But something had seen. And now it had come to collect. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't static. It was a sound Harlan knew too well. A train horn. Deep. Hollow. Coming from the darkness beyond where the tracks had disappeared. A train that shouldn't exist. A train that wasn't his. The mustangs moved again, splitting apart like opening doors. And beyond them, emerging from the black void of the missing rails, another locomotive was coming. Not just any locomotive. The Union Pacific 4872. His train. But that was impossible, because he was still sitting in it. Harlan couldn't move. His body felt rooted to the floor of the cab, his breath shallow, his fingers gripping the dead controls like they could somehow save him. But nothing could explain what he was seeing. Another train, his train, was coming straight for him. It roared forward from the darkness where the tracks had vanished, headlights cutting through the dust-filled air, its steel form rattling against rails that shouldn't exist. It was impossible. A nightmare made real. But the worst part? The cab was empty. Harlan knew every inch of the Union Pacific 4872. He had spent years inside it, memorizing the scratches on the dashboard, the worn edges of the levers, the slight hesitation in the throttle when you pushed it forward too fast. And yet, here it was again, identical in every way, but with no engineer, no crew, no one inside. It was running on its own, grinding forward with an eerie, mechanical purpose, as if something unseen had taken hold of it and sent it straight toward him. The mustangs flanking the tracks remained still, unmoved by the thunderous approach of the second train. Their eyes reflected the oncoming headlights, their bodies like statues against the shifting desert dust. Harlan felt the weight of their gaze, heavy and knowing. They weren't here to stop it. They weren't here to flee. Because this train wasn't coming for them. It was coming for him. His legs finally obeyed, and he stumbled back inside his cab, slamming his hand onto the throttle. He yanked it backward, hard, but nothing happened. The engine was dead. The lights inside flickered, the dials on the dashboard sat motionless, the air brakes unresponsive. He hit the ignition switch again and again, but the steel beast beneath him remained silent. His train, the real one, was no longer running. Because it wasn't on the tracks anymore. His stomach twisted. He had known something was wrong the second he saw the rails disappear, but now the full realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. Trains didn't stop without tracks. They derailed. They flipped. They crumpled under their own weight. But somehow, his locomotive had come to a perfect stop, suspended in a place that shouldn't exist. And now, something had come to replace it. Miles Carter was still there, standing between the advancing train and the mustangs, his body casting long, shifting shadows across the gravel. The headlights carved his face into something sharper, more hollow, as if the years he should have aged had drained out of him all at once. And then he spoke. "You never stopped, Harlan." His voice wasn't accusing. It wasn't angry. It was just a fact. A cold, immovable truth. The train wasn't slowing down. It wasn't giving him time to argue. It was coming, whether he was ready or not. The horn let out one final, deafening wail. Harlan Graves, for the first time in his life, had nowhere left to run. The Union Pacific 4872 barreled forward, an unstoppable force roaring out of the abyss where the tracks had vanished. Its headlights burned like twin suns, its horn wailed with a terrible finality, and its steel wheels screamed against rails that shouldn't exist. But the train was real. Harlan could feel it. He could feel the vibration in his chest, the pressure in the air as it charged toward him. And deep inside, he knew what was coming. This was his reckoning. His hands were still gripping the dead controls, fingers aching from the force. He had spent his whole life on these rails, trusting the tracks to always lead him forward. But now there were no tracks, no route, no escape. He had ignored the warning signs, ignored the consequences, ignored Miles Carter standing on those rails that night. And now the tracks had brought him back to the moment he had tried to forget. Miles stood between the two trains, unmoved, untouched, unafraid. The mustangs stood with him, their dark eyes reflecting the oncoming headlights, their bodies as still as gravestones. They had never been here to stop the train. They had been here to guide it. "It's time, Harlan," Miles said. The words sent a shudder through him, but there was no anger in them. No resentment. No accusations. Just the weight of something inevitable. Something that had been set in motion the moment Harlan let himself believe that some things could just disappear if you didn't look back. The train was almost there. The rails, the ones that shouldn't exist, gleamed beneath its wheels. Harlan could see the reflection of his own face in the windshield of the ghost locomotive, but there was no one inside. No one driving it. Just like that night. He had told himself that he couldn't have stopped in time. That Miles Carter had made his choice. But deep down, Harlan had known the truth all along. He had seen the man. He had heard the man. And he had kept moving forward anyway. Now so was the train. The last thing Harlan saw was Miles stepping aside, the mustangs parting as if they were letting something pass through them. And then, impact. A deafening crash swallowed the desert. But the Union Pacific 4872 never left the tracks. The next morning, when the sun rose over the Nevada horizon, railroad dispatchers found Harlan's train idling on the rails, untouched, as if it had never moved. But Harlan Graves was gone. No body. No sign of a struggle. Just an empty cab and a set of hoofprints leading into the desert. Did you enjoy this story? Then leave a like for more chilling and mysterious tales like this. What do you think really happened to Harlan Graves? Drop your theory in the comments below. Don't miss the next story. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And remember, if you ever see a herd of mustangs blocking the tracks, maybe it's best not to stop and find out why.